I'm sorry, our soloist, Ann Kunitero, is ill today and will not be singing. And I'm not going to fill in for her either. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, city that murders the prophets and stones the messengers, how often have I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you would not. The words of Jesus according to the Gospel of Luke. Mothers do matter, we all know that. None of us would be here this morning without her. The card my wife got this week says it quite well. In the beginning, God created the world and populated it with children. And after a time, he looked down and said, heavens, this place is a zoo. So he created pets. And after a time, he looked down and said, what an ungodly mess, you kids need a shepherd. So he created dads. And after a time, he looked down and was astonished to see the whole works going straight to hell in a handbasket. So he created moms. And after a time, the Lord looked down and said, that's good. The writer of the card is wiser than he, or was it perhaps she, knew. If you remember your Bible, the very last thing that God creates, the pinnacle of his creation, is woman, wife, mother. Mother matters. Mother matters more than most of the roles, tasks, enterprises, careers that receive so much recognition in our time and culture. Indeed, here's a case where the importance of the work is in inverse ratio to the applause it gets. And by the way, it is above all work. I'm amused, sadly so, when I hear someone ask a young mother surrounded by 2 or 3 little ones, do you work? Are they blind? Of course she works. Difficult, depleting, often dull work, 24-hour guard duty, entertaining but often irritating, enjoyable but often exhausting, demanding by the very nature of their dependency and needs, unbridled needs, unlimited needs. You can't decide to move the 2 o'clock feeding to 4 without hell to pay. You can't decide to skip a school pickup because you're not feeling too well. They do dominate your life. I remember it well. You can't schedule them. You can't schedule quality time at Thursday at 6. You can't organize them. They are totally unpredictable. Read about an elderly woman in the neighborhood who heard the doorbell and was greeted at the door by a couple of her little neighbors whom she knew well, a 5-year-old girl and a 4-year-old brother. But the little girl this day introduced herself as Susie and said, this is my husband, and we thought we would come to visit you. So the grandmotherly woman played along, invited them in, sat them down on the sofa, offered them a lemonade. When they drank a while, they sat there very serious and adult-like. But when she offered them a second, the little girl said quite sedately, no, I think we should be going now. My husband has wet his pants. Mother is work, and it is important work because upon that work depends the future of the child and therefore the future of all of us. The issue is not altruism. The issue is the efficiency of our business, the safety of our streets, the skill of our workforce, the strength of our economy, the effectiveness of our schools 20 years from now, as well as the happiness of our homes and each one of us. I say this against a kind of individualism abroad which says something like this. You cannot live your life in and through other people, your husband, your children, your wife. You cannot find your identity and worth by being an appendage. You got to learn to be a person in your own right. Carla Dowling, in her book Perfect Women, the thesis of which is in one sentence: to find yourself, you must break loose from conventional roles and ties and expectations and learn to be your own person. Such an appealing, seducing half-truth. Of course, there are dependencies that one should grow out of as one hopefully grows up, But the high premium that modern culture places on individual pursuits and accomplishments overlooks the truth that we do finally find our significance and salvation as human beings not in self-promotion, but in healthy relationships where we learn to matter to one another deeply. Life that is worth anything at all is relational, and that's at the heart and center of the biblical picture and faith. And the sad thing about the modern appeal is that it ignores reality. It seduces men and women alike into thinking that they can be somebody apart from deep, sharing relationships in family and friendship and camaraderie, that they can find some fulfillment in self-expression, in self-exploitation. Bridget Berger, sociologist out at Harvard, a woman note, writes, "Modernity has opened up a hitherto unimagined range of options, yet their very number has resulted in more confusion than happiness. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the lives of some American women today, who seem to grow angrier and angrier the closer their demands for total liberation are fulfilled. Once liberated, women begin to discover something very unexpected, that meaning is not necessarily to be found out there in the public world. Rather, it is more likely to be found in the private sphere, in the traditional interests of family and neighborhood and religion. And by the way, there's abundant evidence that this is where most men find their real meaning as well." The sad thing about the modern appeal is that it overlooks another reality. Never before has there been such need for mothering, for parenting, for investment in the next generation. Perhaps the crucial issue in the survival of our society as peaceable and productive is the maintenance of healthy family and friendship. All the evidence seems quite clear. We're in deep trouble if we do not revive on a broad scale commitment to strong family life, where children learn love and values, are given time and attention. I know we tire of reading and hearing that the family in America is in crisis. But the American family is at risk. The facts are quite clear. Newsweek points out that the family has more permutations these days than a poker deal. 6 of 10 children will live with a single parent sometime before their 18th birthday. Half of all marriages will end in divorce, and 75% of all divorces involve children. Jean Esheltane, professor of ethics, University of Chicago, explores the enigma of why it is that just at the time when democracy is triumphing all around our world, our democracy seems in such trouble. And her conclusion is, quote, "If democratic society is to be sustained in the future, it requires strong families, much stronger families than we've seen in this country for more than a generation. Over the long run," she writes, "stemming the tide of family collapse is the best protection we can offer a child against becoming either the victim of or perpetrator of violence, or, as it turns out, poverty." So the issue is not whether women should work outside the home or not, traditional versus contemporary roles in marriage. The issue is whether, against the call of the current culture, we will all face the fact that life lies in what we are to and for one another in those most intimate and powerful relationships. Whether we'll give the time and attention to them that'll enable us all to grow healthy and happy and whole into a hopeful future. Rushworth Kidder, a journalist, went to interview well-known historian Barbara Tuchman shortly before she died. He writes, "As Mrs. Tuchman stood in the doorway of her rambling Connecticut home to welcome me, she looked like everybody's ideal grandmother, graying, smiling, short of stature, but erect in bearing, secure in an authority learned less through public acclaim than private insight. And our conversation, like her books, was innocent of any grand schemes or overarching design. She had no great plans to advance, no thesis to prove. So what she said obviously came straight from her heart. My own concern," she said, "is the crumbling of the family. Absent the underpinnings of family life," she argued, "the very substance and fabric of the future, the world's children, will find themselves adrift in a moral void." It's a concern as unpretentious as her life itself, as grandmotherly as her demeanor, and as universal as the human drama that flows through her books. It was the concern of a woman who really cares. And so I say that anyone who gives and cares toward tomorrow ought to be saluted and affirmed as doing that which is crucial for all our tomorrows. And mother especially matters, and we need to tell her so in every way we can. Mothers matter. And mothers matter even if they make mistakes. Imagine that. If one of the problems of the day is that mothers and others are too easily diverted into concerns other than those that are primary and central to life, then another is the siren call of the experts to a perfectionism in many ways far worse and far more debilitating than the legalisms of any fundamentalist religion. All these self-help books and seminars telling you all how to do it, how to be super mom or pop, may actually be counterproductive. They may generate a kind of uncertainty and anxiety and guilt, a kind of second guessing which produces precisely the wrong atmosphere for healthy growth and goodness. Robert Coles, well-known Harvard psychiatrist, observes, we can't feed our children, discipline our children, select schools for our children, books or games for our children, even, it seems, have an ordinary conversation with our children without consulting someone who claims to be in the know. And loss of self-respect and common sense and security is the principal reason why we turn to specialists as if God had chosen them to reveal himself to us. I think one thing is certain, though: anxious, uncertain, insecure parents who cannot permit themselves to make mistakes are likely to do a worse job than those who can be comfortable with less than perfection. One woman writes, after 3 sons, I had my first daughter and I was scared to death. And I called my mother. And my mother told me, relax. You'll see there's no such thing as a little girl, they're just short women. Just as there's no such thing as a grown man, they're just tall boys. You know, I sometimes think that my mother did the job well for me because she'd never read the books. She just sort of went along, did the best she could without worrying too much about whether she was warping me or depriving me. Mothers must have permission to make mistakes, to be human, because that's when mother comes into her own, is at her best, as we all are. The worst possible training for life in reality would be a mother and father who are absolutely perfect. Stop and think about it. When we visit an anxious perfectionism upon our children, we do more to make growth difficult and life hard than any very human failing could ever do. If we pay attention to the things that we know count, if we give it our best shot, if we relax and trust God a bit to make up the difference, it'll work out. We need to learn again what an old faith continually presses upon us. There is no such thing as perfection, only direction and the confidence that God is part of the picture, and kids do grow up. Mothers matter, even human imperfect mothers. But then finally, so does mothering of any kind. Jesus never married. He had no children. And yet he had many children whom he longed to mother, as a hen, he says, gathers her children under her wings. And you know, given the absent mothers and the ill mothers and the mothers alone and the dysfunctional mothers and fathers, we must do more than care for our own if we care at all about the future of even our own. Reality is, all of us at every stage of life need intimate relationships which involve really 2 primary dynamics, what the theologians like to call law and grace. Perhaps better in our time we should say we need from one another affirmation and accountability. We need acceptance and high expectation. We need gift and demand. We need nagging and nurture. We need unconditional love and challenge. My wife got another Mother's Day card, which came too late to get in the text, but let me read it to you. Mom, over the years, with your great training, constant guiding, never-ending patience and understanding, I've got to admit, Dad turned out pretty good. We all need, at any stage of life, affirmation and accountability, acceptance and high expectation, gift and demand, unconditional love and challenge. One parent can provide these, but it's tough, especially if she doesn't have some partners like you and me. Part of the wisdom in the presence of two parents is that it involves a kind of division of labor around both of these dynamics. One might almost say a division of personality. And it's not always mother kissing the wounds and father causing them. Barbara Bush, in an article in Newsweek magazine this week, is quoted as saying about their family, George Sr. is the soft touch, and I'm the enforcer. I'm the one who writes, shape up. He writes, you're marvelous. And indeed, these are never hard and fast distinctions. We may all learn to nurture and to lead. Speak the truth, writes the apostle, in love. Mother matters, mothering matters. And then finally, I think mother at her best mirrors the very grace of God himself, makes the love of God real. The faith teaches us that we know real life only as we experience a vital and lively relationship with God and his love. But where does the child, indeed where do most of us, find such love credible and tangible and real, more than just froth from the pulpit of a Sunday morning? Is it not as we experience it, however partially and imperfectly, in and through the affirmations and expectations of one another? When she stays true to herself, I think mother comes closer to reflecting the love of God than anyone. And it's certainly that love that is primary, the security and the motivation for all of us. If Jesus' word for God is Father, the love he lives out in those New Testament stories often looks much more like mother. He's always encouraging, he's always feeding, and applying band-aids when needed. He's persistent, hopeful, refuses to give up his dogged attachment to his people. Indeed, this is the picture he gives us in his lament that is so appropriate even now. O Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her brood. Lovely story about Marian Anderson and her mother. Marian, as a young girl, could not afford vocal training, but she kept right on singing anyway and gave such joy to the members of her little Philadelphia church that they raised $126 in pennies and nickels and dimes and labeled it the Fund for Marian Anderson's Future. So she started taking vocal lessons. When she was 18, her high school teachers arranged an audition with a world-famous vocal coach. And again, the church folk raised money for lessons, and the future looked bright. And then the roof fell in. A group who believed in her sponsored a concert in New York City's Town Hall. But no way was Marian Anderson ready for Town Hall, either in experience or personal maturity, and the critics flayed her. She felt she could hardly bear it. She went into a depression. She'd let those down who believed in her. For over a year, she wallowed in self-pity, and she would not go near a vocal coach. Then one day, her mother, who had agonized for her, as you can well imagine, and who was with her through it all, she finally managed to get through to Marian. Marian, she said one day, grace must come before greatness. Why don't you think about this failure in that light, in that way? And later in life, Marian Anderson, who helped many another young singer survive the kind of despair that she had tasted in that first bitter defeat, later on she said, whatever is in my voice, faith has put it there. Faith in the love of God and faith in my mother's love. And her words, grace must come before greatness. Because she learned through her mother's words and way that grace which mothers all of us into life. So that's Mother's privilege, and yours and mine as well, to be interpreters, even in small and imperfect ways, of the very affirmation and expectation of our God, and it's a task and role more important than any other in the world, and it doesn't require anything like perfection at all, and it'll never make CNN, but it will make the crucial difference in our world. It can shape the future as nothing else. We can bring the God who embraces, who grows, who heals, to one another, rather like